Have you ever wondered if a discarded life can find its value again? The story of Cell, an alien girl who was thrown away, deemed broken, might make you rethink that idea. She is not just a tool or an object cast aside, but a being full of hope and suffering. When Dominion brings Morgan, a man who lost his sister because of them, an abandoned life, he is faced with a big question: can he turn his back once again? Or will he stand up, not just for her, but for himself? The Kuro's refueling dock floated in silence, cradled by darkness at the far edge of civilized space where trade routes ended and memory faded. Steel walls echoed with distant creaks and a soft whir of systems too old to trust but too stubborn to fail. Inside the last word, Morgan sat alone. The glow of an aging terminal flickered across his face as he scrolled through a half-loaded auction feed. One boot rested lazily on the console. A frayed cable hung between his fingers, forgotten in his mouth. It was just another night. Or it was, until the stars shifted. No warning. No signal. The Dominion ship fell from the sky like a blade. Smooth. Cold. Intentional. It didn't request clearance, it simply took it. Its hull sliced through the quiet with military precision, settling onto the landing pad outside as if the space had always belonged to it. Morgan didn't move at first. His gaze locked onto the screen as telemetry shifted. The ID came through, diplomatic envoy. His chest tightened. That couldn't be right. No diplomat came this far out. And certainly not for him. He rose slowly. The quiet weight of muscle memory guiding his hand toward the revolver duct tape beneath the NAV panel just in case. A hiss broke the stillness. The outer airlock groaned open. The smell of scorched alloy and cold protocol seeped in before the figure did. The emissary stepped forward, obsidian armor polished like stone under pressure, silver inlays catching dim light. A helmet rested beneath one arm, his face unreadable beneath skin threaded with biocircuitry that glimmered faintly, like something alive and watching. No greetings. No explanation. Morgan, he said flat, factual. Behind him, a hover sled floated silently, carrying a long stasis pod. Its corners were chipped. The Dominion crest scratched and blackened, as though someone had tried, and failed, to erase it. The pod turned. Suspended inside, barely conscious, her body twitching in glitch-like spasms, was a woman. Or what remained of one. Skin like deep violet dusk. Black hair adrift in a sedative fluid. Biomechanical plating laced across her limbs, elegant but broken, sparking where neural circuits had failed. This is Cell, the emissary said. Deemed defective. Service terminated. Morgan stared. Dominion protocol requires disposal, the voice continued. But exceptions are made. You once rendered assistance to a high counselor. 6 cycles ago. Unofficial, but not forgotten. Morgan folded his arms. I didn't ask for a reward. You're not being given one, the emissary replied. He gestured. The pod shifted again. Use her. Strip her. Recycle her. Or entertain yourself. Whatever pleases you. Morgan's jaw locked. Get that off my landing pad. She is yours whether you acknowledge her or not. To leave her now would confirm her status as waste. He didn't answer. Didn't move. The emissary didn't wait. He gave the faintest flicker of a smile, too thin to be warmth, too practiced to be human, then turned and walked back into the shuttle. The ship lifted off before the ramp had sealed, disappearing into the night like it had never been there. Only the scorched scent of exhaust remained. And her. The pod hummed, soft and wrong, the screen cracked near the base, flickering with broken telemetry. Her eyes didn't open. Her chest barely moved. But the damage had been meticulous. Controlled. As if someone had taken her apart, not to kill her but to cancel her. Morgan stood there a long time. He should have walked away. He would have years ago. Sold the tech. Stripped the shell. Cut his losses. But he wasn't that man anymore. Not since the day Dominion patrols stepped over Kira's body without even slowing down. Not since her blood pooled across the hangar floor while they looked past her like she was nothing. He looked at the pod again. At the scar running down the side of her temple. Straight. Precise. Surgical. Dominion hadn't broken her by accident. They had made a choice. And so would he. Morgan reached out and touched the manual override. The room breathed with a soft hum, low, steady, and strangely alive. Warm amber lights hovered near the ceiling, casting long shadows that clung to the bulkheads like forgotten memories. This wasn't a hospital. It wasn't mercy. It was just quiet enough to pretend. Morgan stood over the pod, hand resting near the emergency release. Beneath the translucent shell, her body floated in silence, suspended in fluid that shimmered like liquid glass. One breath. Then another. Barely. With a final hiss, the seals disengaged. Cryogel drained slowly, trailing steam across the deck like morning fog. The pod opened in silence. No alarm. No ceremony. Just a soft, final exhale. She fell. Her frame dropped to the padded floor with a soft thud too light to sound violent, too sudden to feel peaceful. Her limbs folded beneath her, boneless, weightless, like a puppet with cut strings. Hair slicked against her face in strands of ink. Her skin held the color of dusk lavender and gray tinged with an unnatural sheen. Biomechanical plating curled along her arms and legs, delicate in design but fractured at the edges. Wires flickered, damaged, and confused, sending erratic signals through trembling muscle. Morgan crouched beside her. She didn't speak. Didn't move. Her face was smooth, youthful. But her eyes, when they finally blinked open, were wide and unfocused. Not empty. Not blank. Just trying to remember. Her mouth parted, and from her lips came a sound thin, brittle, like memory breaking through a storm of silence. Arinth. Kai. 40. 3 words. No inflection. No context. But they struck him harder than any weapon could have. Not a name. Not a language. A code. His breath caught. Morgan didn't know what Arinth Kai was, not really. Just rumors, the ghost from black archives. A phrase that never belonged in any official record but always surfaced in whispers, in the corners of war stories and discarded data streams. A place. A program. A warning. She collapsed again, her body curling slightly as the last of the cryogel evaporated from her skin. He didn't touch her. He just sat there beside her, watching the rise and fall of breath that had no right to continue, listening to the faint crackle of faulty circuitry trying to reconnect. Her fingertips twitched. Not in pain, something else. Recognition. As if her body remembered something she hadn't caught up to yet. Morgan looked at her face, and in the stillness, in the hum of that broken room, he knew this wasn't salvage. Wasn't scrap. Whatever Arinthkai was, it had survived. And now, it was looking back at him. The stillness wrapped around her like fog, weightless but present. A silence not born of power-down systems, but of space itself holding its breath. She drifted in and out of sleep, her body still repairing, but her mind had started to wander places not even the Dominion could erase. It began with light. Soft. Blue. Undulating like a heartbeat beneath frosted glass. Then came the hallway, endless, transparent, suspended between stars. The walls were made of glass, and through them, constellations hung like ancient watchers. The floor beneath her was quiet, absorbing every step she didn't take. She was there, younger, less bound. No armor. No orders. And down the corridor, music. Not synthetic tones or controlled chimes. Something warmer. Strings. Fingers. Wood. A guitar. The melody was delicate, unsteady in rhythm, but honest in its imperfection. It floated through the air like a memory trying to become real. She followed it, drawn without command. Drawn like something once hers had just called her name. Then she saw him. Seated at the far end of the corridor, back slightly hunched over the instrument. A man. Human. His face was obscured by the light, but the way he played quiet, steady, it stirred something buried too deep to name. He wasn't performing. He was remembering. And in that moment, so was she. Her breath caught in a dream. Then the light fractured, and the corridor dissolved. She woke with a shallow gasp. The low light of the ship greeted her, not blue this time, but warm gold, flickering from the stripped-down wall panels. And beyond the partially open door, the sound hadn't left. Real, now. A string. A pluck. A pause. Outside, seated near the edge of the corridor, Morgan sat cross-legged, adjusting the tuning pegs of an old guitar. The instrument looked out of place, its body scratched, the wood dulled by years. But his fingers moved across it with surprising care, as if the act itself was a form of remembering. She didn't call to him. She watched. And slowly, something in her chest tightened, not in pain, but in recognition. Not of the sound, but of the man. The same hands. The same stillness. The same pull in her gut that she couldn't explain. And for the first time since awakening, she wondered if this meeting wasn't the beginning, but the return. The engine room pulsed with a steady warmth, soft vibrations echoing beneath the floor, like the vessel itself was breathing in slow rhythm. Amber light spilled from overhead ducts, wrapping the steel panels in a gentle glow that made the space feel less like machinery, more like memory. She stood near the bulkhead, one hand braced against the wall, the other clenched tight at her side. Each breath came with effort. Each movement sparked resistance from the limbs she no longer fully controlled. But she moved anyway. A step. Shaky. Shallow. Another. The third betrayed her. Her knee gave out, and she dropped hard but without a sound of surprise. Pain rippled through her, sharp at first, then dull like a bruise that never faded. Her fingers dug into the metal floor, searching for balance. Morgan didn't move. He stood a few paces away, silent. Not frozen, just present. His hands at his sides, his eyes calm, not with indifference, but with understanding. He didn't reach for her. He gave her space. He gave her choice. She met his gaze from the floor, her chest rising in short, uneven rhythm. The edges of her resolve had started to fray, but the fire hadn't dimmed. Not yet. She steadied herself, teeth clenched, muscles strained as she forced her legs beneath her again. The motion was raw, imperfect but hers. And then, without thinking, the question rose from somewhere deeper than memory. Why are you really helping me? Her voice was quiet, but not fragile. Morgan's reply came without hesitation. Because I failed to save someone once, he said. And I won't fail again. The words didn't echo. They settled between them like gravity. She didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, truly looked. Not like an enemy. Not like an assignment. But like someone searching for the thing behind the face. In his stillness, she saw it. Loss. A wound still healing, shaped differently than her own, but just as deep. And in that space, something shifted. Not loudly. Not suddenly. Just enough. They weren't strangers. Not anymore. Just two souls fractured in different ways, drawn together not by fate, but by the quiet ache of recognition. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt safe. The ship was asleep. Every vent hummed in low rhythm, every panel dimmed to a quiet glow. The stillness wasn't empty, just full of breath, full of waiting. She woke in silence. No gasp, no scream. Just the still echo of something cold unraveling inside her. Her skin, damp with memory. Her chest, rising and falling like it wasn't sure whether to trust the air. She lay still, eyes open, staring at nothing, until she felt it. A presence beyond the door. A shadow moved. Footsteps soft, careful, not trying to hide, just not wanting to break the quiet. Morgan stepped in. He didn't speak. He didn't ask what haunted her. He simply crossed the room and sat beside her, the cot creaking under his weight. His face half lit by the amber cast of the console light, his expression unreadable but open. He reached out, slowly. Not to take. Not to fix. Just to offer. His fingertips brushed her forward. A gesture not of comfort, but of grounding. Of saying, "You're here. You're not alone." She turned toward him, eyes meeting his. They didn't look away. Nothing needed explaining. The silence between them was heavy with meaning, but soft with understanding. His hand stayed near her cheek. Her fingers lifted, touched his wrist, tentative, then sure. And in that small motion, the distance dissolved. Their foreheads met, breath mingling. A pause. Then a kiss. Not urgent. Not desperate. It was slow. Full. Like a question answered with a whisper instead of a word. A kiss that asked nothing, and gave everything. They held each other not for passion, but for permission. To trust. To rest. To feel again. He eased down beside her. She turned toward him, curling into the shape of his body like it was the place she'd always been running from and toward. No words passed. No names. Just warmth. Just presence. Their hands found each other beneath a blanket, fingers lacing as if they'd always known how. And in the quiet, something shifted. Not in their bodies, but in the space between them where fear had once lived, and now, didn't. She breathed against his chest. He closed his eyes. And when sleep came again, it wasn't chased by nightmares. It came gently. Because for the first time in a long time, they were held. Not as prisoners of the past, but as people who had chosen to stay. It started with a flicker. A quiet pulse across the sensor grid, soft enough to ignore, steady enough to feel wrong. Then came the sound. A low chime. Not loud. Not urgent. But final. Morgan looked up from the console. A soft crimson glow washed over the bridge, casting long shadows across the floor. The ship had shifted its systems tense, as if holding breath. He leaned in. Hands moving with practiced calm, he scanned the codes. The glyphs blinking across the screen weren't random. They were Dominion signatures. Layered, encrypted, deliberate. Behind him, she stepped into the doorway, silent as breath. The dim emergency lighting caught on the edges of her skin, the violet tone flickering against the red. Her eyes locked on the screen. She didn't need translation. "They found me," she said quietly. Morgan didn't look at her. He was still reading. Processing. "It's not a patrol," he murmured. "It's command-level targeting." He paused, then turned. "They are not here to capture you?" A beat. "They are here to erase you?" She didn't flinch. "They don't think you're defective anymore." His voice trailed off as he stared at the screen, the weight of the data settling in. "They think you're dangerous." The silence deepened, not empty, but sharp. Alive. She moved closer, stepping beside him. Her gaze traced the Dominion lines cascading down the interface. Each one a sentence. Each one a death warrant dressed in protocol. "They are afraid," she said, her voice even. "Afraid of what?" Her fingers hovered over a line of repeating command logic. Then she looked at him. "Not of what I am. Of what I might inspire." Morgan frowned. "They are not trying to stop me," she continued. "They are trying to stop the idea of me. The anomaly. The mistake that remembered how to feel." Her eyes found his again. "If one prototype can wake up, so can the others." And just like that, it made sense. This wasn't retaliation. It was containment. Not of her body, but of her potential. Morgan exhaled, slow and steady. His fingers curled slightly against the console. They don't want you gone because you failed? She nodded. They want me gone, because I didn't. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not just the threat they feared, but the promise they tried to bury. And in that charged stillness, he said the only thing that mattered. Then we make sure they remember exactly what they tried to destroy. The room barely breathed. Only the soft pulse of interface lights flickered across metal walls, casting a dim reflection on her skin. Everything inside the chamber seemed to hum in anticipation. Serial sat motionless in a sink chair, her body threaded with cables, lines of light snaking from her spine into the system's core. She didn't blink. Didn't speak. Just waited. Morgan stood beside her, the neural visor slipping down across his eyes. His hands hovered above the console, the weight of what they were about to uncover settling into his chest. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. Barely. The command triggered. The sink surged instantly. Her body jerked. Her spine arched. Muscles seized in waves. A spark of white fire laced across her arms. Her eyes flew open, bright, glassy, unfocused. And then she screamed. A deep, tearing sound, not from pain, but memory. Not just remembering, reliving. The light in the room dimmed as her mind dropped beneath the surface. Inside her, doors slammed open. She was submerged in something thick and cold. Not water. Something heavier. She couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Just drifted. A stasis tank. Glass curved above her like the sky. Beyond it, white walls, humming softly. Monitors blinking in surgical rhythm. She wasn't dreaming. She was back. Voices echoed through the fluid. Dominion. Flat. Calculated. Subject Serial 1A, emotional variance exceeds threshold. Prototype failed. Recommend termination. Another voice responded. Deeper. Human. Quietly defiant. No. She's stabilizing. Transfer her to Arinth Kai. I'll take responsibility. Her heart seized. The sound. The tone. The way he said it, it wasn't just recorded memory. It was real. She turned her gaze inside the vision. And there, just beyond the glass, him. Younger. Fiercer. Tired in the eyes, but unbroken. It was Morgan. Not a version of him. Him. He was there. Years ago. In the shadows of a program she hadn't even known she was part of. He was the reason she'd survived. The vision twisted. New images burned in. Metal restraints. Pain threading into her spine. Dominion scientists programming feelings into her like algorithms: joy, grief, love downloaded. Synthetic. And yet, something inside her refused to stay artificial. And always on the edges he watched. He protected. Quietly. Recklessly. Repeatedly. Then the light broke. The memory shattered. And she collapsed forward, gasping. Morgan yanked the visor off and caught her before she hit the floor. Her body trembled with aftershocks. Her breath came in short, stunned pulls. But her eyes were clear. "I saw you," she whispered. Not a dream. Not a vision. You were there. He blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? You saved me, she breathed. Before I even knew what saving meant. Her hand reached up slow, deliberate, touching the side of his face. My memory forgot you. But my body didn't. And for a moment, the air shifted. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was recognition. Something buried so deep, it had taken everything just to surface again. He said nothing. But in that quiet, between the rhythm of her breath and the pulse of old machines still humming in the walls, it became clear. Their story hadn't begun here. It had just finally returned to where it started. The air was thick with silence, an ancient kind, untouched by breath or presence. Dust floated like memories, swirling in soft spirals as Morgan led them deeper into the forgotten vault. Each footstep echoed like a whisper against rusted steel. Serial walked beside him, quiet, but not uncertain. She knew this place. Here was where the world had once ended for her. Where the Dominion shut her down. Where her name had been stripped and replaced with a number. They reached the heart of the facility. A wide, circular chamber. Cold. Echoing. In the center, a stasis pod lay open. Its glass fractured, its cradle empty. She stared at it not as a prisoner but as someone who had returned. Morgan moved to the console, fingers gliding across its half-dead interface. Static flickered. Data bloomed, fragmented, and raw. Then lines of names. Serials. Prototypes. 5 more. Her voice caught. There were others. One entry blinked, corrupted, but alive. Unknown status. Possibly active. But before the weight of that truth could settle, a shriek tore through the vault. The alarm. The ceiling hissed open. Metal groaned like something waking. Dominion soldiers dropped from above. Tall. Armored. Featureless. Behind them, a drone hovered like a sentinel, its eye burning red. Morgan raised his weapon. But Serial stepped forward. The soldier's voice rang out, cold and final. Serial 1A. Violation of containment. Submit for reintegration. Or be terminated. She didn't blink. Her voice calm. Controlled. Sharp as a blade drawn slowly in silence. I am not your weapon. A breath. I am not your failure. She looked straight through the visor, and spoke as if to the entire machine that once owned her. I am free. And then everything changed. Her body lit from within, veins of silver sparking beneath her skin. One word left her lips. Barely louder than a breath. Omega shift. The room convulsed. An invisible force tore outward like a shockwave wrapped in light. The drone spasmed midair. Soldiers froze, armor locking, limbs jerking. Sparks flew. And then collapse. All at once. No gunfire. No screams. Just silence. Deep. Final. Serial stood alone in the stillness. Breathing hard. But standing. Morgan lowered his weapon slowly. He didn't move toward her. He didn't speak. Because something sacred had just happened. She turned, eyes glowing with something ancient and awake. "They built me to obey," she said. "But they never understood choice." Morgan stepped closer, voice low, reverent. "You didn't use a weapon," he said. "You were one." But she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Not anymore. I'm not made for war." She placed her hand against her chest. "I was made, but I chose this. I chose me." And in that ruined chamber where she was once erased, she rewrote herself. Not as a number. Not as a tool. But as someone who had finally taken her soul back. The sky was painted in molten amber, casting soft gold over the porch where time seemed to slow. Wind moved like memory through the pale leaf trees, brushing against the fabric canopy above, a quiet breath across the bones of their shelter. Serial stepped out, barefoot, her movement unhurried. The wood beneath her feet held warmth from the sun, worn smooth by days of quiet passing. Her silhouette caught the dying light, violet skin bathed in the colors of dusk. She paused at the edge of the porch. One hand braced gently against the beam. The other drifted down. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Her voice was barely louder than the wind, but it carried everything. "Morgan, I think I'm pregnant." A stillness followed. Not silence, but something deeper, a shift in the air, in gravity itself. He came up behind her slowly, wordlessly. No urgency. No panic. Just presence. His hand found hers, settled over her fingers where they pressed lightly against her belly. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. And then, softly. "Then it means they didn't win." The breeze moved around them like a sigh of the planet itself. No machines watching. No data being written. No orders to follow. Only breath. Skin. Sky. This wasn't part of anyone's design. Not a mission. Not an accident. Not the result of protocol. It was a beginning they chose. A quiet, defiant miracle. Serial leaned into him, eyes half closed. Not from exhaustion, but from something softer, something that only grows in the absence of fear. Because for the first time since she was created, her body was not being used. It was being trusted. And from that trust, something new had begun. Something with no code name. No designation. Just a heartbeat waiting to be heard. She didn't cry. He didn't speak again. There was no need. The stars above hadn't changed. But she had. And beneath the sky that once watched her break, she stood alive, whole, and carrying something no machine could replicate. Hope. The stars hung heavy above them, silent witnesses in a sky deeper than memory. The night air wrapped around their small home like a secret kept only between the two of them, cool, still, and sacred. They sat close on the wooden steps, knees nearly touching, as if any distance now felt unnatural. The porch creaked beneath their quiet. Time had stopped needing to count itself. Serial stared upward, eyes tracing constellations she couldn't name, their shapes unfamiliar but strangely calming. Light from the stars shimmered across her skin like old echoes, soft and silver. Her voice broke the silence not out of fear, but from something gentler. "Do people like me deserve this?" She didn't look at him when she asked. Didn't have to. The question lived more in the stillness than in the words. Morgan turned to her, slow and grounded, as if the answer was already there beneath his breath, behind his eyes. "You're not what they made," he said. "You're what you chose to become." She turned, meeting his gaze. Her lips parted, then softened into the quietest smile. Not because she needed his approval, but because she finally believed it. "Then I choose." A pause. Small. Sacred. To never leave. Their kiss came not as a rush or release, but like the closing of a circle. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't to fill a wound. It was a promise. A quiet declaration beneath a sky that once watched her suffer and now watched her stay. Not as a weapon. Not as a project. But as a woman. Whole. Awake. Free. And this time, love not because she had value, but because she had chosen to exist. Chosen to stay. And the stars cold and far shone warmer somehow. As if they, too, had been waiting for this moment to arrive. And so, the story of Morgan and Sel, from a meeting full of abandonment and despair, became a journey of hope and rebirth. The discarded alien girl not only found her value again but also helped Morgan face the pain of his past and rediscover a reason to live. Together, they overcame every barrier, from the pursuit of dominion to buried memories, to discover a new world where they could be free, a place where no one had the right to decide their fate. But will the path ahead truly lead them to freedom, or will new challenges await? Their story is far from over, and Morgan and Sel's journey will surely hold many more surprises. If you feel this battle isn't over, don't forget to return for the next videos to follow them as they fight for freedom and love in the vastness of space. Because a story never truly ends, it just waits for us to continue exploring. Be sure to hit follow and stay tuned for the next chapters so you don't miss a single moment of this journey.